Hey, Honey Wash Day. This is Toksa Hour. I am Maggie Ross, and I am live from Porcupine, South Dakota, where the porcupines roam along the Porcupine Creek. I'm glad you guys all made it. This has been an exciting conversation we've been waiting for. Uh, I have special guest, Dr. Liam O'Mara. He is a historian and he is also a college professor. He comes live from his place of books. This is one of the things that I really enjoy about Dr. Liam is that he has all the books in the world, as you can see. And he also has very friendly cats that come and entertain and get involved in the discussion. So, good morning, Dr. Liam.
Morning. Yeah, happy to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, it's relatively early in the day still. But yeah,
Yeah, you're
it's
an
a nice way
hour
to start the day.
behind. So, Dr. Liam, we have had several shows of Doksha Hour, and if you don't recall, I am from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, so I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe.
Mhm.
Many of the people who view Doksha Hour do this from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, our South Dakota, the Rosebud Indian Reservation, Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, and Rapid City, South Dakota. So we also have a viewing audience that goes beyond that, but normally Doksha Hour has been kind of looking at our communities and trying to share and give information. So that's our viewing audience. And so we've had several shows where we invited Palestinian Americans to come and talk about Gaza, talk about some of the history of what is going on. And there has always been in the comments different types of questions in regards to, well, like what's the history of it, or who are the people? Who are the people of Palestine? Because we hear a lot of propaganda about the Jewish community currently in Israel are the people, and this is their chosen land, and they're just returning back to their land. And so then it kind of leaves the question about, like, well, who are the Palestinians? Like they've been there forever.
Right.
So who are they? So I don't know if you want to go ahead and just do an introduction of yourself for the audience, and then maybe we just get started into the conversation about the history of Palestine.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Liam O'Mara. As Maggie said, I'm a professor of history. My discipline is cultural history and the history of ideas. But I focus on Europe and the Middle East, so broadly the Mediterranean basin. And that kind of gets me sucked into things like the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I've been teaching for, gosh, near 20 years now. But my interests really straddle the ancient and the modern world, because I like looking at long-term changes in cultures and ideas. So this is actually a really interesting question that I don't think a lot of people cover particularly well, too, because people usually specialize in different periods, and then because for anybody who doesn't know, there's different disciplines in history, different approaches. So, like, social history focuses a lot on economic interactions, or military history, or diplomatic history, things like that. But the history of ideas is about the long-term transformations of cultures and identities and whatnot. And that's what I tend to do a lot of. So, for the specific question of Palestine, the simplest answer is that Palestinians and Jews and Lebanese are all ultimately descended from exactly the same people. It's the same population, but you head off in different historical directions, and cultures and languages shift. Um, this is something that, well, thinking specifically of, like, yeah, Ogallala Sioux, like, okay, so yeah, people can be speaking the Lakota or Dakota languages, or they can be speaking English. I mean, languages shift, right? Religions can change, right? Think, how many people are holding to traditional religions? They essentially went more or less extinct and are facing some revival, but most people become various forms of Christian over time, right? And you can see that same kind of transformation happening over thousands of years in in the Levant, which will take people from the Canaanite polytheism into Samaritanism and Judaism and into Christianity and into Islam, but it's ultimately the same people just heading off in different directions. So that at least is a start, and we can get more specific if you want. But
Yeah, well, this is like my backstory. So I growing up on the reservation and like just trying to understand like why people came here and did what they did to my ancestors and trying to figure that out and understand. I went to school and I studied history, and history is my undergraduate degree. And so I went back and I was always so fascinated because I followed it all the way back, right? I went to Europe and I was trying to figure out why Europe, what was going on in Europe. And then you start going further back and you get into the Crusades and you get, and you go further back and you end up in ancient history. And that's kind of where I kind of stayed around in that area, really trying to understand. And what it ended up coming to my realization is that it wasn't really the people themselves. It was more had to do with the thought or the thinking. Like what is it that really does give a person the power and belief to feel like they have a right, they have a right to impose oppression or colonization or something else on another people. I've listened to you talk at great length about this, and I've always just enjoy Dr. Liam. I met him on TikTok. That's where I met him, on TikTok. He's my TikTok friend, and he does lives all the time. So if you're in TikTok world, you can go to Dr. Liam. You can find him in TikTok as Dr. Liam. I think it is, isn't it, Dr. Liam O'Mara?
it has Liam O'Mara, the fourth PhD, I think is the name on it, but it's always the same. Like Liam O'Mara IV is my little handle, which you can find me on social media. So I try to keep it consistent that way.
Yeah, so he's there. But anyways, so what do you think about that? Like the process of thought
Mhm.
and what happens in our minds?
Yeah, for you really need things like that in order to understand where imperialism, colonialism, whatnot come from. They're ideas. Peoples can be around for a long time and then all of a sudden shift into a different way of living and decide to attack other people. Um, it's never the people in a kind of fundamental sense, in a kind of like, ontological sense, biological sense. No, it's always cultural ideals. Europe actually was a backwater for most of its history, relatively insignificant. Well, all of our earliest developments, cultural ideals, the things that kind of create civilization have nothing to do with Europe at all. Even even in the modern period, when you're going to look at the rise of capitalism, it depends upon tons of ideas that came from the outside. A lot of the basic rudiments of it started in the Arab world and were adopted in. But they managed to perfect a particular approach to capitalism that's relatively predatory, and that encouraged them to reach outward. And the particular understanding that they had for a while about it involved a kind of, well, there's a finite amount of wealth in the world. So it's sort of like whoever dies of the most toys wins kind of ideal. Like there's a set pie and you want a larger slice. And that involves control of resources because rather than thinking in terms of trade, which a lot of people do now and just specializing in different areas, you had to keep everything inside the system. So if you live in, I don't know, England or France or something, and you want rice or tea, well, tough shit because it doesn't grow there unless you control another piece of territory. So you go and conquer a piece of territory where you can grow rice or tea and not have to buy it from somebody else. Because the idea is to have more and more of the currency, the actual gold and silver and whatnot, flowing into the country and nothing going out. So it stays in it. And that sets them off culturally in this conquest, you know? They have to rationalize that. There's a great deal of effort put into inventing ideas that would help people to justify what they were doing. And ultimately, that's where things like racism come from. Racism was a way to rationalize the slave trade when it took off, because people have always, you know, enslaved each other. I mean, there's that's nothing particularly unusual in the world, but because of the introduction of mercantile capitalism, you have a particularly predatory form of it, trying to move as many people as possible and putting them to work making money for somebody. Well, that means the conditions are going to be quite inhumane, you know, like really horrific. So you have to say, oh, well, they're not really human, you know, they're like some subspecies or whatever, and it's justified to do that. You have to make up this bullshit idea because people at the time were looking at these conditions. This is horrifying. I can't do this. We can't treat people like this. You have similar issues in the Americas with the conquest. All the Native American populations are going in. All these conquistadors are enslaving large numbers of people and working them to death. And priests are like, "Hey, this is messed up. We shouldn't do this." They're humans, so you have to come with it. Oh, well, they're not really. And like, how do you rationalize that? How do you justify control over territories? And then as this evolves over the next few centuries, you end up with the whole civilizing mission rhetoric. We're here to um, improve the way people live. Oh, look, they have land, but they're not using it correctly. So we'll teach them how to do it. And that just somehow nakedly benefits you, but you justify like, oh, we're bringing civilization and progress and Christianity and everything else, and we're bringing these new positive ideas. But all you're doing is coming up with a way to justify your indefinite control. And honestly, the shifts in religion, the shifts in language, shifts in culture that were imposed upon people are a way of justifying that control indefinitely. Because if you can change the way people think of themselves, you get them to persecute themselves. And this is unfortunately why large parts of the world today have this obsession with lighter skin, because there's this association with it being somehow better and tied to these earlier civilizations, and people attacking their own cultures and attacking their own history, pushing it aside, adopting, again, continuing to become Christian because it got associated at a particular moment in world history with progress and civilization. So it's a kind of like mental colonization that makes it a lot harder ultimately to resist imperialism. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's all a set of ideas that you can impose, but they're related to power structures, to capital, to empire. They work in concert. If you look at only one or the other, it doesn't make sense. But if you connect the ideas to the centers of power, it makes a lot more sense.
I've been thinking about this just from understanding like what is taught in the thought processes of Western civilization and the expansion of Western civilization. And today, um, the Israeli state has done a very intentional propaganda against the Palestinians, calling them like, using terms they used for us, right? Like they're animals, they're savages, um, and looking at that and making it really look like they are not intelligent and that they had no place in history. And if you study Western civilization, you understand, I mean, at least I understand that the roots of Western civilization began there, right? In the Middle East. Like that's, and then it goes outward. So it comes from Egypt, it comes from Greece, it comes from, and then it expands in the thoughts and so forth. And so it totally forgets, or they try to totally forget, like, what is the contribution to the world of the Palestinian people and their thought processes.
Yeah, I mean the major Abrahamic faiths all start in that area. So ultimately, it is their ancestors who created all these things. And then the whole region more broadly, I mean, where did writing come from? You know, like the idea of like building large cities, it's all Near Eastern. It's not European at all. But we, when we connect those things to Western civilization, we are, in a sense, accepting a bit of propaganda from the early modern period because Western civilization was just made up. It's not a real thing. Western Europeans actually had less in common with the old Greco-Roman cultures than the Near East did, because the Arab world, where Palestine is a direct linear heir to Roman civilization, because Rome lasted 1,000 years longer in the East than it did in the West. And when the Arabs rode up into that area, they found people that still had public baths and running water and all kinds of stuff. You know, the in the Middle Ages, no one in Europe looked at North Africa or the Middle East and thought they were inferior. They consciously understood quite directly that they had all the good ideas and Europeans had to borrow them and translate them in. All the early European universities had a department of Arabic that the chair would pick out. These are the books we're going to translate from Arabic into Latin this year and introduce and start teaching, because they had everything. It wasn't just that they inherited and preserved what was left of Greek and Roman civilizations and a lot of the other ones, you know, the Syriac, you know, the Coptic, you know, Persian ideas, but they also continued to build on it, to expand upon it. I mean, if you think about something that a lot of people think is very fundamental to Europe, this rise of science and philosophy, you know, trying to, you know, think beyond stuff. I mean, Europeans wouldn't do it at all until Muslims had proven that you could be a monotheist and still be a scientist. You know, they made looking at old Greek thinkers like Aristotle safe for monotheists, and then Europeans just copied that work, you know, translated it in, and then came up with their own spin on it. But all that science was happening there first. Western civilization is, in essence, invented around the 15th century because of the Ottoman threat. You know, the Ottoman Empire, you know, which had united large parts of the Arab and Turkic worlds together and created this powerful empire, was threatening Europe, had proven that it was powerful enough to defeat any alliance or coalition of European powers all at once. And people were terrified, and a lot of people began converting. This is why you have Muslim minorities all over Eastern Europe. You know, places like Bulgaria are like 15% Muslim. You've got, the Albanians, the Bosniaks. I mean, there's tons of peoples in Europe that their ancestors had adopted it. And Europeans were beginning to move from Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. Because if you're a peasant in early modern England, you're going to stay a peasant. But if you move to North Africa and convert, next thing you know, you could have your own freaking castle on the coast and be like a major lord or something, because it was more meritocratic. And they needed a way to keep people from doing that. So they invented a rhetorical strategy. They invented the West. And they argued that they were a superior civilization, distinct from, and that there was no way to do it. Because before, all you could do is you could talk about the religion. You could say, well, you know, Islam is a heresy. It's a bullshit religion. But they have better cities and, you know, like cleaner water. We throw our poop into the middle of the street and wait for the rain to take it out. They have freaking sewers. I mean, you couldn't compare yourself civilizationally, but you could criticize them only in religious terms. With the invention of Western civilization, you draw a line across the Mediterranean that cuts North Africa and the Middle East off and says they're fundamentally different. Realistically, if you want to think about civilizations themselves, like distinct cultural areas, then the entire Muslim world is part of Western civilization. But the way the term has historically been used was invented specifically to cut that area off. And that's only in the modern period. No one in the Middle Ages would have had any idea what the hell you were talking about. And you can still see tons of evidence of that. The way of life in modern Tunisia and in Sicily is very much the same. The basic daily rhythms, of life, the pattern. Oh, we're going to take a nap in the afternoon after a long lunch. And, these are the kinds of foods we eat. Even after 500 years of arguing that there's a fundamental difference, the long-term interconnections are still there. So it's honestly a con. I still resent the idea that people will teach Western civilization as a distinct thing because it's just it's made up.
I think about that as well. Like when when you go and study the history, then you kind of start to see that, right? Like they how the expansion. So I feel like my history degree was a little bit propagandized itself because of how it was presented. And so it was very much presented from a Christian lens. And so you have to really go about trying to undo that on your own. And it also seems like the controlling of these narratives, because it's very similar to the narrative that we always have to face here in North America, is that we came from South Africa, or we came from Africa, and we migrated up and we came across the Bering Strait. And this happened, 30 some thousand years ago. And then we find out, or what was it, 18,000 years ago. So then they have to extend it to 20,000 and then 30,000 or whatever, it just keeps going. Um, and, uh, and then would they keep finding different artifacts in the Americas that say that the people in on this continent were here much, much longer. And so it's just kind of like this continuation of a narrative to try to dehumanize certain groups of people. And so we are constantly under that attack for dehumanization, but also, like looking at what they're doing to the Palestinians. Even they did the flower massacre a couple weeks ago, I think it was. And you look at some of the video coming out where they're trying to get food, they're just trying to scrape the flour up off the ground. They're trying to, all of these different things just so that they can make bread. And and we look at that, and that can be in a sense to show, oh, look at those guys. They're savages, or they're, look at how they're doing this. And but it's a real struggle, like their humanitarian aid is getting destroyed, and they're hungry.
Yeah, there's a long history of using people's material circumstances, even if you caused them, as a way to delegitimize them. I mean, just looking back again in the early modern period, the development of the Atlantic slave trade and showing up in those areas and demanding more and more people, all of the governments in West Africa were outlawing the practice and stopping people from doing it. But then the Europeans just show up and they offer even more money, and they convince people to attack each other, attack their neighbors, sell people out. And that over time, what it does is it delegitimizes those governments because people are breaking the laws to make money because someone's offering them so much money to do it. So it starts state collapses. And particularly in large parts of the northern part of West Africa, people were literally depopulating, a significant part of the area because it was so profitable to do so. So by the time Europeans later decided to seize control of that land and move in, they're like, gosh, there's nothing here. There's no governments. It's a bunch of like savages or something. Well, they caused that by causing a systems collapse. So all those governments, disappeared. But they're there. We have the history of them, but they were victims of this. But then they use those conditions to justify what they're doing. And you see a lot of that in the Mideast. There's a long history of delegitimizing the entire region. You want to talk about Christianity as a part of Western civilization? Well, hell, that's Palestinian. I mean, where did it come from? I mean, where's this Jesus guy come from? Dude, he's from that region. And the religion built up significantly in the Eastern Mediterranean long before it got to Europe. I mean, some early popes are literally Syrian Palestinian, but then it becomes very much a European thing, and then they start passing on, oh, this is our religion. Well, no, it's literally a Middle Eastern religion. I mean, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have the same basic DNA. They all come from the same area. They all borrow the same stories and build on the same myths. But somehow Europeans decided this one is ours, and those are all cut off. One of the saddest ironies, I think, of because there were multiple competing forms of Zionism. Even if you set aside the ancient, like, religious, let's go home but not necessarily conquer people kind of ideal. But if you look at the three main secular varieties that developed in the 19th century, the ethno-national one is the one that won and created the state of Israel. And that's a really unfortunate development, that was the one that ended up coming out on top, because that's the one that has to adopt dehumanizing rhetoric, because it's a form of violent European ethno-nationalism. I mean, I've literally seen comic books made for Zionist kids where you've got knights in armor on horses like crusaders, and it looks like the Crusades, but with the blue and white and the Magen David, and like, Jews were victims of the Crusades. They were massacred by crusaders, but they're adopting the same kind of civilizational distinction, because that form of Zionism is born in Eastern Europe, and it develops as a European cultural phenomenon. So it is heir to a lot of those racist discourses that had built up in the centuries before the rise of Zionism. So it's harder to then interact in the area. Now, there are a lot of people in Israel who've always opposed this. In particular, there's an interesting split in a lot of the Eastern Jewish populations, the Mizrahim, the peoples who came largely out of the Arab and Iranian worlds, because a lot of them didn't have that crap before. So some end up charging really deeply into it to try and make up for the fact that they weren't like the Europeans. So, and you've got this kind of phenomenon in lots of different minority communities, the kind of like model minority sort of ideal, where you have to like get to be super, super patriotic and connected to this other alien culture. But you also have people saying, hey, hello, we were perfectly fine in Iraq for a long time. This is bullshit. What are you talking about? Where there's a lot of those people with that ancestry looking at the Palestinians as brothers and wondering what the hell happened. It's a very complex phenomenon, but at the end of the day, the fact that a big part of the Zionist movement adopted some of the most racist and horrific ideals out of modern Europe and took them there does have consequences for how this has played out for Palestinians.
So could you talk a little bit about the beginnings, when Abraham had the vision or the message, and how he came and or journeyed, migrated. Would you talk about that?
So beginnings as in the beginnings of the religious ideals?
Yes. Yeah.
It really depends on how you want to frame things like that, because there's both the mythic understanding, how is it understood within the religious system, and then there's how we have to understand this historically and archaeologically. And I can give you either or both, but they are very different actually.
I think for the viewers, it would be good to do both, because sometimes we're not privy to both. We may just only be privy to one version of it.
Yeah, the simple way, if you're looking at the biblical narratives, and there are differences between the way that Christians and Jews interpret the same texts, but the figure of Abraham, who's supposed to be the beginning of this whole process, the first major patriarch in Judaism, comes from Ur of the Chaldees. So he's from what is today southern Iraq, and then he migrates in and establishes himself in Canaan. And when he first arrives there, there's actually interactions described in the Bible with what we would have to call Palestinian kings, because he's interacting with the Philistines. But he establishes himself there, and his peoples, and then at some point they end up having to move to Egypt, and then while they're in Egypt, they're later enslaved, and then they have to seek freedom from slavery, and that's where Moshe or Moses comes in, and Moses leads them sort of victoriously out of Egypt after demonstrations of God's power with the plagues. Wanders around in the Sinai for a while because the people are afraid of fighting for the control of the Holy Land, because they see all the Canaanite city states and like, we can't do that, so they have to all die out. But then you lead a couple million people in, and they conquer the area, burn cities down, and establish their kingdom. And in the mythic understanding, it's becomes a single large kingdom, that unites much of what we would today call Palestine. But then it breaks into two, Judah and Yisrael. And in the biblical understanding, Yisrael is destroyed first because they were worshiping God wrong and God was mad. And then later they get destroyed too, so they have to understand how that goes. And and it creates this long-term dynamic where you begin to understand God as a God of history who will interact in the world and manipulate other peoples to punish you if you don't do it right. The sense of chosenness originally in Judaism is more an argument that they have a special responsibility and also tons of special punishments for doing things wrong. It's not intended to be a discourse of supremacy. For some people, it'll become that only because of modern, European imperialism, but it's not traditionally part of the religion itself. The historical version of this, same quick run, is that Abraham isn't actually a person. Abraham is a myth that was used later in order to explain why there's so much of Mesopotamian culture in the Levant. The Israelites, instead of being an outside conquering force, are literally indigenous to Canaan. Out of the region here, you end up with several different kingdoms developing at different times, different variations on the language and the religion. The earliest elements of Judaism are literally part of Canaanite polytheism. So the oldest name for God, El, is literally the Canaanite sky god. And tons of the other gods mentioned in the Bible are all gods that they used to worship, but they begin to diverge from them a bit to develop distinct cultural narratives, distinct versions of that. And one of those is going ultimately to push toward monotheism over long periods of time. The Abraham story helps to explain why so many things are held in common. The calendar system that Jews still use is Mesopotamian. The weights and measures that were used are Mesopotamian. The earliest kind of currencies mentioned. So if anyone's reading the Bible and they hear, like, I don't know, oh gosh, the parable of the prodigal son that even Jesus uses, because it's a Jewish story, talks about here are a few talents, my son, to start your wealth or whatever. A talent is a 66-pound hunk of metal that was used as a very early attempt to approximate currencies. They're not really coins, but there's a ton of direct links. So the Abraham story helps to explain that. For the Moses story, too, you have a similar issue. There's no mass exodus out, but there is a need to explain why a few new ideas come in from outside sources. Because for several centuries in the late Bronze Age, Egypt literally controlled that region. So it was part of its empire. Just in terms of chronology, when people argue for an exodus taking place in the time of like Ramesses II, it makes no sense because the entire Holy Land was still part of Egypt at the time. It's like if I'm trying to get away from the FBI, I can't run from California to South Dakota because they can still get me. It's the same country, different subdivisions in it, but it's the same country. Um, but there is a long-term cultural influence from Egyptian control, and you have to explain that. The actual figure of Moses, the root for his name is actually Egyptian, not Hebrew. It just gains a Hebrew meaning over time. So part of that story is intended to help us understand, why do we have this new interpretation of God? Why is God becoming closer to monotheistic, right? And much more powerful, a God of like history and action. That's what you got with the plagues, because El wouldn't do things like that. Sky gods don't intervene much. They don't do things. They don't punish peoples. But you're trying to explain a kind of God that would. So it's sort of important to understand that while the name for God that they're adapting to, what some people would render as like Jehovah or Yahweh, or just like, those forms of the name, because you're squishing that together with El. That God concept is originally local, but the way that he acts is not. It doesn't fit their earlier understandings. So there may be influences of things like the early form of monotheism in Egypt from Atonism, where one God has more power over everything instead of different gods doing different things. But it evolves in a particular direction. That Judaism that builds up here in Palestine actually even there has multiple forms. One of them we still see in existence. It's tiny, but the Samaritan community are an older form of this that are quite distinct from Judaism. There's a wave there. So they have a common basis in some of their stories, but they take them in different directions, and they just keep building up from there. So that's the ultimate origin of it. I mean, it's interesting that in the mythic understanding, they always wanted to understand themselves as an outside power that was given that land by God. But technically, they are also an indigenous culture, just like with the Palestinians. The Palestinians that exist today are descendants from Jews and Samaritans who just converted over time, and they became Christian, and many of them later became Muslim, because languages and religions keep changing in the region. But they all have the same basic roots in the land. They all evolved in Canaan.
I just really love history. I love storytelling too. So it's always like I always try to be objective about it, like think about things and points of view. Points of view are really big with me. So I will oftentimes go listen to people who are more, maybe I don't necessarily agree so much with, but I want to understand like what it is their what's their point of view on this and where does that come from. And so there's always this big religious conversation that occurs um, as the basis of everything. And so in the comments, there's some discussion or some questioning about so is war or is let's see if I can find it now. I wrote it down. So they're asking, so are these wars based on ideology and religious beliefs? When
The conflict as it exists today is not originally religious at all. It's a matter of cultural orientation. The secular Zionist movement that went in and started the process of colonization that would culminate in Israel, most of them were not even religious. For many of them, God was just a myth from the past, but they had a secular identity as Jews because in Europe, Jews were not fully able to assimilate. They were always held apart as a different other population. So we often squish them all together today, but anti-Judaism, Judeophobia, and anti-Semitism are actually three different major are different forces. One of them has a theological basis. Judeophobia is just a fear of people who are different from you. They're other. They can't assimilate. They're not quite like you, and that all these ultimately create like the racist nationalist form of anti-Semitism, which is a 19th century development. But there's a long-term history, for a couple millennia in Europe of looking at the Jews as, you don't really belong here. And people built on that, their sense of self culturally as a distinct people, but not in the religious terms. And that started them moving in. So it's essentially a conflict between nationalist movements, arguing for control over territory and a safe place to live. And because the cultures had shifted, it was difficult for some forms of Zionism to look at the Palestinians as brothers. But there were versions that did so. So there's a Zionist binational movement that wants to create a Palestinian state and work with them, but still, we're Jews, you're not, but we're all going to live together here. And then there's all the socialist versions that want to do the same thing. Let's bring people together. But the ethnic nationalist one is the one that dominated. And it's the one that says Palestinians are different from us and therefore they don't belong. So you have to deny their indigeneity. So it's a matter of culturally nationalist discourses and the adoption of elements of European racist discourses, creating completely distinct populations that have to be then removed. You know, you can either assimilate them or remove them. If they don't want to become Jewish, which people often don't choose to do, then you have to get rid of them somehow. The in the contemporary world, there is a religious dimension to it, and this is where it gets really weird for people. But that really only starts to develop in the 1960s. Before that point, religion played no real part in this struggle at all. But there is a growing Jewish fundamentalism that actually has a very distinctly weird theology, a weird understanding of it, where instead of we're going to wait for the Messiah to come, so Hamashiach will come in at some point, and then he'll remake the world, and all will be right again. They're like, no, we can actually convince God to send the Messiah instead of just passively waiting, and we do that by pushing out all the Palestinians, establishing settlements everywhere, and then rebuilding the temple and monarchy. So there's it's relatively small, but it's quite powerful because of the structure of the state. But there's a small movement inside Israel that literally wants to turn Israel from a secular democracy into a theocracy, into a halakhic state, something under like Jewish religious law that has a temple and a monarchy. And they think if they do that, God will see that we are worthy, we will be redeemed, and then he'll send the Messiah. That's very much a 20th century interpretation of Judaism that did not exist before the creation of the state of Israel. And it only becomes more important after the 1960s. But there are some current people in the cabinet in Israel who come from that movement. So from them, they use a lot of religious language. But over the last, century and a half, this has been going on for them. That was usually really uncommon. People didn't use that kind of framing. But the longer this goes on, the more important that becomes. And it's led to a similar development amongst a lot of Muslims. So all the way up to the 1970s, Islam played no role at all in resistance to Zionism. It just wasn't relevant. But the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is formed in 1976, and then Hamas is formed in 1987. So it begins to take on a form, and largely that's a reaction to the fact that secular leftist nationalist movements in the Middle East were failing. Arab nationalism was a significant movement before, and Arab nationalism was a secular, center-left movement. It had nothing to do with the religion at all, but it failed consistently to actually fight Israel, so it got itself discredited. That's a lot of these are like much bigger things that I'm only giving thumbnail sketches based on the time. But with the loss of that, they have also embraced more of a religious conception, and that's changed the character of the conflict. So today it often looks like a fight between Judaism and Islam, but that's a minority on both sides. Most Muslims in Palestine are not with Hamas, and most Jews in Israel are not aligned with the religious Zionism, but they talk a lot. So it starts to look like a clash culturally between them. At the end of the day, this is still just about control over land. It's still just a secular imperialist conflict.
That's deep.
Well, yeah, we're trying to like squish through long stretches of time in just a few seconds. It's going to be kind of screwy that way. But yeah, the fight originally was just between secular nationalist movements. I want to create a country, built around my sense of self, my people, my nation. And you've got competing national movements. So because the Zionist movement came in and a majority of Zionists started saying, you are not like us, you are different, using the same kind of othering discourses that the Europeans did, setting them aside. So Palestinians developed their own distinct nationalist movement. They always had a different identity. People arguing today that Palestine is a new thing, a new made-up thing. People always understood that they lived in Palestine because it's a geographic term that's been used in the area literally since the Bronze Age, the end of the Bronze Age. It's got a long history in the area, and it became more and more common for people to understand, at least, even if they had a different political identity, they thought of themselves as part of like Greater Syria, or they were part of the Ottoman Empire or the Mamluk state or whatever. Their political identities were always different, but they understood where they lived. They developed a nationalist movement arguing for a state for their people because the Zionists were doing that and claiming all of it. And then you end up with two exclusivist nationalist movements fighting each other. And over time, both of them also developed religious dimensions, but they weren't there originally. Those were kind of bolted on later, by a subset of each movement. And that kind of complicates it because a lot of people from the outside look at this and they think the whole thing is driven by religion. And it's really a relatively small part of it, but it is important. It's one of the reasons that dividing the territory is not going to work terribly well, because you've got people with a religious attachment to land that would be in the other state, and they're never going to be happy with that. So you'll end up with, tons of fighting and terror and resistance, everything else going on forever. I mean, if Israel was actually serious about peace at any point, and it really hasn't been, but if it really wanted to divide the land up and create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, what do you do with the 650,000 some 700,000 some settlers that live there? And a lot of them are there because of those religious dimensions, because that's literally the biblical heartland. If you want to talk about where the original Jewish states were, they were in the West Bank, not in the where Israel is today. So the people who do care about religion, they play a big part in the conflict today because of the arguments for peace. So it makes them stronger. It makes this harder to resolve, because for them, if they gave up that land, it's tantamount to saying, okay, God, we don't want the Messiah after all, it's fine, which they can't do, for religious reasons. So they're a relatively small share of the total population, but they punch way above their weight because this is a very significant issue for them. And it does make this issue harder to resolve. But most Israelis are very secular, and so are Palestinians. If you poll Palestinians, do you want an Islamic state like Hamas talks about 5% say yes. A lot of people support Hamas because they're a resistance movement or whatever, and because they're attacking, but not for the religious reasons. The religion is a small dynamic on both sides. It's just actually significant.
I often get that too, like the focus of the religious point of view or religious perspective, and as we know in the Facebook world, there's a lot of suppression with the algorithms here. But you go over to TikTok, and there's a lot of education going on in regards to what is really maybe going on. So there's the speculation about the canal, like there's a canal that they're wanting to build. It's been what, 2, 3, 4 decades or something. They had it planned. I can't remember the exact time. And then then there's this whole idea of the oil, the natural gas that's in Gaza. And then now we know that the Israeli government had this big convention on reselling, right? They're trying to resell Gaza Strip. And so they're demolishing it. They're going to rebuild it into this big, nice community, I guess.
Yeah, the latter is definitely happening. There are people there are already people walking in trying to start building things, just like they do illegal settlements all the time in the West Bank. And if they last long enough, the state tends to just hook them up to utilities and retroactively acknowledge them. That is definitely a realistic prospect here. The problem with the canal and the fossil fuel stuff is there is a tendency for people to want to find an explanation for something that doesn't make sense. Why would people do this, right? And then you work within the limited information that you have available. So they can look really, really compelling. Realistically, neither of those are a factor in this. But we can understand why people would latch onto them. The canal project was actually abandoned decades ago. It was just seen as economically non-viable. And if they were to build it by ethnically cleansing 2 million people out of Gaza, there'd be such resistance to take up for it that it wouldn't make back the money that it cost to build. It's not actually economically feasible. It wasn't even before that process, and it wouldn't be if they even went to the north of Gaza and had an outlet somewhere around like Ashdod or something. You still couldn't do it. But because people did talk about it decades ago, it's made a comeback. The fossil fuels are all off the coast. And because Israel is the only recognized sovereign territory in the area, they already have access to it. They're already able to steal that. This, again, sort of assumes that Gaza is somehow a sovereign entity, and it's not. One third of Israel's water supply today is actually pumped out of West Bank aquifers. They're taking the water out from underneath Palestinians' feet because they have control over it, and Palestinians do not. The same thing is true with offshore oil and gas. The only people they had to worry about were the other countries in the area, and they've already worked out deals with through back channel negotiations with the Lebanese. They have direct deals with the Cypriots. Like how do you divide the seabed to have access to this? They don't need the Palestinians' permission to steal all that gas. They can already do it. But if we want to think that there actually is a separate government in the Gaza Strip and that they have access to that and that Israel needs to steal it, then you start thinking, oh, well, that's why they have to get rid of the people. They don't. They can literally just take it out from under their feet already. But there is always a need to try and explain what's happening. Our brains are pattern engines. They like making sense of the world. And you take the pieces that you know and you fit it on together. This makes a great deal of sense. Things are usually more complicated, though.
Yeah, everywhere, everywhere. Um, so I have some questions and just jump back to the religion aspect. Have some questions about Jesus and the question of, I have one question asking if he, um, is the mythical Jesus belief false? And then I have another question about, does Jesus have descendants?
Um, it really depends on how you want to take things, because again, the theological understandings and the historical understandings can be very, very different. And there are ways in which you can make a case that the Jesus figure himself is a mythical composite, sort of an invented character. I don't think that that's particularly reasonable, and most scholars don't. We think that there is a person who inspired this religion, but that person would have been a rabbi. It would have been an actual preacher. The Pharisaic movement that gave birth to rabbinical Judaism was calling for a more decentralized religion. Instead of ever having to go to the temple and the priests and sacrificing there, you can just gather together and pray in small groups and, like pray at home alone, like have a more direct relationship with God. And that's the kind of stuff that Jesus is talking about. He fits very much into that reform movement that's building up in the first century. And even the terms too that sometimes show up, is this the carpenter or something, or the carpenter's son. There's if you We have problems sometimes of words moving from one language to another, right? And there's an Aramaic word that if you translate this into Greek, actually could, you could go from like architect to teacher, So people took a word for is this the teacher? And you end up with, is this a carpenter? There's a lot of twists along the way where words, once they're rendered into another language, get funky. In fact, the whole virgin birth idea comes from a Greek mistranslation of a line in the Hebrew Bible, talking about a future savior born of a young woman. But the Hebrew word for young woman, when they translated it, they chose the Greek word for maiden. But the Hebrew word doesn't actually say anything about whether the person is married or not. There's a lot of twists like that. Jesus himself, if you look at the way that he's first calling to followers in the story, he's saying, you have to leave behind your family, give up all your possessions and wealth, and then you can follow me. And if you think, if he's about 30 years old, he'd be married with kids. What he's telling his apostles to do, he probably did himself. And there are some non-canonical texts, that they decided to leave out of the Bible when they finally codified it later, that do talk about, him having been married or something. So it's entirely possible. Where people do ask about descendants, though, there's literally no possible way of finding them. That's just modern mythology that people are trying to make something up. There's no there's nothing in the text that supports a relationship with Mary Magdalene that was romantic. But there are hints in the text that he would have been married with kids before he started his mission. They're lost to time, you know? So probably there are descendants of this person, but the actual Yeshua ben Yosef that becomes Jesus wouldn't have been Christian anyway. He's literally Jewish. And he was telling all of his followers to be Jewish. And in the Gospels, he never breaks Jewish laws. He stays faithful to that system. So there's no one would have actually separated them somehow and created a descent, you know? That again, that's modern myths. I think there really was a person there, but the way that Christianity develops is a much longer process than people tend to think. Within the first 5 centuries, there was a tremendous variety of beliefs that all called themselves Christian. Some saying you got to be Jewish to be Christian, others saying that the Jewish God is an evil God and Christ is a completely separate God. So it's like a dualistic, fight between a good and evil God. There were ones that said there's only one God, but Jesus is a special, like, adopted prophetic son of God. So he's like symbolically chosen as God's son, but he was just human, right? And others saying, well, he wasn't born at all. He's like an incarnation of God, kind of like a South Asian avatar. Like, he's an incarnation of Vishnu. Like, he's just God took human form. Like, and they leave the whole birth and all the rest of the stuff out. Everyone had tons of different ideas. But over time, through arguments among the bishops, like through their dialogues, they chose ideas that they wanted to be the standard. And within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, you always have to argue, well, God is inspiring them to choose the right things and to leave out the bad ideas. But at the end of the day, it's a political fight, an argument over the right way to do it. And many early forms of Christianity go extinct. Some simply branch off and go in different ways. So, like, still today, the Assyrian Church of the East, Nestorian Christianity, it's small, but it exists. And their understanding is that Jesus and the Christ are different things. And the Christ essence kind of comes down and possesses Jesus for those 3 years. And then when he's on the cross, just before he dies, it detaches and goes because God can't die. They have a different understanding of Christology. That there's a lot of that diversity early on, but most of it eventually fades away, and you end up with a handful of standardized forms that push the things out. But most of the beliefs that make up Christianity, they wouldn't be recognizable to Jesus, because again, Jesus lived and died as a Torah Jew, but most Christian beliefs and practices actually originate in the Hellenistic world. So they're adaptations of other religious beliefs that exist in the area. And this is where it gets funky for people. It's not as simple as saying that they cobbled it together from all those Hellenistic beliefs, but it's a natural process of influence and trying to reach out to new people. So you take on an aspect of their thought. Think about how Christianity spread in the colonial periods too. They often would find a way to put it into the language of the people they're trying to convert. They did this a lot with Native Americans. They found ways to take Native American beliefs. Well, that's actually a Christian belief. You just didn't know better. And this is, and they tried to show the similarities, right? I mean, gosh, at one point there was a version of there was a version of the biblical stories that was written to convert like Vikings, like Northern Europeans, and they made Jesus like a warrior walking around with a sword and a bunch of like Viking brothers, his like it's a weird version, but they did it to help spread the faith into the area. You use some of the local language until people get used to it, and over time, some of these elements from other faiths moved into early Christianity way back when. So a lot of the other existing, like we call them mystery religions or mystery cults, they all contribute elements to what becomes Christianity, because you're bringing together people with different beliefs and you're squishing them together into a new whole. So it's hard because again, there's a mythic understanding, there's an understanding within Christianity of what it is, but historically and archaeologically, when we actually look at the texts and their development and we see all the different steps along the way and all these different councils, it gives a very different understanding of what it is.
Again, so much to think about. So much to think about. So I'm gonna do these plugs because if you want to hear more about this conversation, you want to understand more, I would suggest you get a TikTok account and you go find Dr. Liam. He is also on YouTube. I believe he has some YouTube videos. You can go and watch some of his YouTube videos. But if you want to actively engage with him on questions or anything like that, I would go to TikTok, get an account, and then I would find him. He does go live quite frequently. I'm always watching, and the conversations usually just go where, like how they did here, they just go wherever, and you have a lot of different people participating with questions, not only in the panel but also in the chat. And so it's a very good experience to listen to him talk in regards to Palestine, and even like we could even go into fascism and have all of, I mean, he has those conversations going on over there. Today we asked him to come and talk about some of these things about Palestine because we, as the audience, you having a lot more questions as we're going through this experience of watching the genocide. I wanted to kind of close up, Dr. Liam. There's some conversations about anti-Semitism and Zionism. We have a lot of like the clashing, or not clashing, but the combining. So where people are saying, if you speak against Zionism, that is anti-Semitic. So if you talk about that, and then also some questions about World War II and the Holocaust, and whether the question was about, was Hitler more against Jews, or was it the move, whatever Zionists were doing at that time? So if you could, maybe talk about those two things, and then we'll call it a wrap for Toksa Hour.
Okay, let's see. On Hitler first. Hitler honestly didn't really care about Zionism, and as far as he's concerned, if the Jews just left Europe, he'd be fine. It didn't matter to him. There are interesting ways that it overlaps, because he does at one point start manipulating a Palestinian figure who'd fled into exile, and Al Husseini is in Germany, and he uses him to record like anti-Jewish propaganda to recruit Muslims to fight for the Nazis. But people sometimes argue that connects it to the Zionist movement, and that he would have, like, the Palestinians wanted him to go and like free Palestine from and kill off the Jews and all that kind of, all that's bullshit. Hitler really didn't care at all about that issue. He wanted them out of Europe, and the place he wanted to expand into was into where the Soviet Union was. That's the territory he cared about, not the Middle East. The the question of Zionism's relationship to anti-Semitism is relatively complicated. In some ways, some forms of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. Most wouldn't be. Because at the end of the day, Zionism is a political ideology. And opposing a particular form of politics doesn't say anything about a people. Anti-Semitism, strictly speaking, is a nationalist it's like a nationalist kind of scientific racism. It argues that Jews are a distinct race that can't blend in, and therefore they're a threat or whatever. It comes up with a racist way of attacking Jews. Because before, with anti-Judaism and Judeophobia, people could always convert. So I don't know. Think about the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli in the 19th century. He's literally of Jewish origin, but he was Anglican. His family was Anglican. They had converted, so nobody really cared. But with anti-Semitism, you can't convert out of it, because it becomes a fundamental thing. It becomes a racist ideal. And therefore, opposition to a political ideology isn't by definition racist. It's like saying, I don't like conservatives, I don't like liberals, and therefore like that's a racism. No, because being a liberal isn't a freaking race. It just doesn't work that way. It's a set of beliefs, it's a set of ideas. But there are actual anti-Semites, there are racists who are also anti-Zionist, and they overlap. And a lot of times I see an unfortunate amount of this in pro-Palestine circles where people have unconsciously taken in some of these racist arguments and are using them, but they literally come out of like neo-Nazi circles. So when people are making arguments that, well, the Zionists control foreign governments and they manipulate governments and they've been giving dual citizenship to people in Congress and, all this Jewish money from outside the country is manipulating our politics. Those are old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish control of governments and Jewish control of money that people are giving a Zionist spin and linking them. And that's as unfortunate as what the Israeli state has done by arguing that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing, and they're not. Zionism is distinctly a political ideology. Judaism isn't. There's no necessary link between them. And large numbers of Jews, for both religious reasons as well as for cultural, political reasons, have always opposed Zionism. There's always been a significant amount of secular Jews who have opposed it, as well as religious Jews who have opposed it. So Zionism and Judaism aren't the same thing. And opposing Zionism isn't opposing Jews, but it can be depending upon the arguments you use, because there are anti-Semites who slip their rhetoric in, who slip in their little 4chan neo-Nazi rhetoric, and then unfortunately people will take them up because Zionism is made up of a bunch of Jews and people attacking Jews. There's like an overlap that way, So there's an unfortunate connection between them, but there's no necessary connection. I'm Jewish and I have always opposed Zionism because I oppose nationalism as a whole. I don't like any nationalist movement because nationalism involves othering. It involves saying these are the defining features of our people and you are different and don't belong and therefore I have to hate you. That to me is just fundamentally barbaric. All forms of nationalism are problematic, and Zionism, as a form of nationalism, I don't like it. But that doesn't make me anti Semitic. I don't hate Jews. Jews have nothing to do with that.
Yeah, that's kind of where I get to this place of when you're really looking at the Zionism, most of the people like within the Israeli government are Zionists. They're not Jewish. I think Netanyahu even claims that he is atheist, or and quite a few people
No,
kind of
secular.
are claiming
Yeah.
this.
I mean, wouldn't be, it's hard to say that Netanyahu is explicitly atheistic, but it's reasonable, but I don't think it really fits. But he's not religious in any way. But that doesn't mean they're not Jews, because Judaism isn't just a religion. Judaism is also an ethnic and cultural understanding. Jews have always had tons of different views. Jews have always like abandoned their religion and stayed Jewish. If you're a Buddhist Jew, you're still a Jew. Because there's a sense of that cultural inheritance, that history. As long as that history matters to you, as long as you don't fully assimilate, like teach your kids a completely different culture and lose it. So again, think about Native American populations. Some intermarried, left the reservations, blended in, and their kids forgot who they were. And this is how you'll get a lot of people later going like, oh, I'm like 1/16th Cherokee or some, shit later, like, trying to like claim the identity. But their ancestors had literally assimilated. They had abandoned that culture. So you can lose Judaism that way over generations, but most Jews historically don't. They like to hold on to the cultural identity, even if their religious practice differs. So a lot of most Israeli Jews are actually secular. There are a lot more synagogues for Jewish communities in the U.S. than there are in Israel. I've like walked miles and miles and miles through cities. There's no synagogues anywhere. Like, and you talk to people, no one ever goes. Like, it's just not their thing. But they're Jewish. So being Zionist Jew doesn't mean you're not a Jew, but most of them are not strictly speaking religious. That's a relatively small part of the total population there.
And so then when we think about um,
Oh, stretch.
because I follow Code Pink. Yeah, I love those ladies. They go onto the Capitol Hill and they give everybody a hard time.
Yeah.
And right now they are passionate about calling for a permanent ceasefire.
Mhm.
And one of the things that they say is that they are Jewish themselves, and that what the Zionists are doing is hurting them and making it unsafe for them.
It
And
does.
because of those actions. And I think that is something that's really important to know, is like, by making these claims and doing the action that they're doing, and then our government over here, like the state of South Dakota just passed House Bill 1076, I think it's called, and they then say that they adopt the definition of anti-Semitism as established by the International Holocaust. I forget what it stands. IHRA or something like that, and and then their definition goes in and says all of these things and links, and it says that anti-Semitism also is being racist or hatred towards Jewish and non-Jewish people. And I'm sitting there thinking like, well, what do you mean in their properties? So it's like, well, how does non-Jewish people become a part of Semitism, and then how you're like, who's going to fit into the non-Jew category? The
Yeah, that I've never seen before outside of activist groups trying to adopt it and argue, well, Palestinians are Semites because they speak a Semitic language and therefore hating us is anti-Semitic. That's honestly a misuse of the word because anti-Semitism never had anything to do with Semitic peoples or Semitic languages. It's a made-up 19th century racist term for Jews, trying to give it a bit of like I don't know, a false sense of scholarly legitimacy. People just grew up hating Jews, but maybe they're not particularly religious anymore, so they can't hate them for theological reasons. So here's a way to still be racist. Ah, they're a distinct race. Ah, blah blah blah. You make up anti-Semitism. Um, the what I do see a lot of in those House bills and using that definition, and actually the writer of that definition, decades ago, he's publicly been critical of the way that it's been being used. Um, the intent wasn't necessarily to say that any opposition to Zionism is anti-Semitic, but people are often running with that aspect of the definition, saying to oppose Zionism is anti-Semitism. And it's not. It can be because again, some of that uses earlier anti-Semitic tropes. So anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, but by definition, it's not. And misuse of that definition in the way that it's showing up in a lot of politics to try and suppress speech is something the creator of that definition has been publicly critical of. It's a mistake. But what they're trying to do, and this ultimately gets back to simple imperialist logic, they want to support the state of Israel as it currently exists in its ethnocratic element for the same basic reason that the US really supported South Africa when it was an apartheid state. We opposed calls to attack or to divest it, or to separate from that. Our government strongly supported the apartheid government for a long time because they were an ally in our Cold War geopolitics. So because Israel is useful in the US's imperialist fights in the Middle East, they want to support the state as it currently exists. But a lot of us would prefer simply to reform it and take away all the racist laws that exist in Israel. And that would mean you have to criticize aspects of Zionism. And that doesn't have a racist component to it by definition. These laws need to be opposed. And they need to be opposed not only because they're founded on lies, but they're also violations of First Amendment protections. In the same way that during the Cold War they tried to outlaw communism in the U.S. And ban Communist Party membership. That's unconstitutional. It shouldn't have stood. And we need to oppose this stuff for the same basic reasons. They're attacks on our civil liberties.
well, Dr. Liam, thank you for coming over here. I may send you a message and ask you to come back and have conversations on other topics of history. Um, you know, my audience is very open to learning, so and we like it. So thank you for coming and sharing with us. Again, if you enjoyed this conversation and would like more conversation in regards to the history of Palestine, Zionism, anti-Semitism, all of those things, you can find him on TikTok. You can also go find him in YouTube. He goes by the same name as he said at the beginning of the show, Liam O'Mara, Ivy PhD, right? Yeah. And somewhere he's is it the Mad Doctor? I can't remember what you go by.
Yeah, all of my social media is just Liam O'Mara the fourth. So LiamOmaraIv. But my YouTube was named by a friend years ago. And it's Office Hours with the Mad Professor. Just, just kind of saying I'm insane. Um, which is kind of fair. So I'm stuck with that. But yeah, Office Hours with the Mad Professor you'll find on YouTube, and I put up recordings of all the TikTok lives as well as like uploading some of the short videos. I'm way behind on it, but I tend to upload them there as well when I get around to it, and I do other things on it occasionally. But yeah, all my social I'm on all the social apps. You can find me anywhere that way.
And also, I believe if you remember last month, JBS, the TikTok dad, came on here on Toksa Hour. I believe him and Dr. Liam may be starting a podcast soon too. So he's doing a lot of different things on education. So go connect with him. With that, I want to thank everybody for coming, joining in, commenting, sharing the live. And we will see you on Wednesday evening. We'll have Bruce Whalen. He's going to come on and talk about tribal funding for the police. So, okay, with that, you guys, Doksha.